He wasn't rich, powerful, or dressed in polished clothes. He was just a man with steady hands, grease on his shirt, and a talent most people chose to overlook. But one moment of arrogance, one cruel challenge, turned his quiet skill into a public spectacle. What began as a simple task in front of sneering eyes would unravel into something far greater, a test of dignity, strength, and the ugly truth about how society still judges people by the color of their skin. He lived a life of quiet routine, early mornings in the garage, late nights finishing jobs no one else would touch. His hands bore the stains of hard work, his clothes carried the smell of oil and steel, yet behind that rough exterior was a man who found pride in every repair. Engines weren't just machines to him, they were puzzles, proof that with patience and skill, even the most broken things could be made whole again. Neighbors knew him as reliable, a man who never turned down a chance to help. Still, outside his circle, he was often dismissed, judged not by his craft, but by the color of his skin. Strangers saw the grease, the uniform, the skin tone, and overlooked the mind, the talent, the perseverance. He had learned to carry those silent dismissals like an invisible weight. Yet beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. He didn't know it, but he was about to step into a moment that would test more than his ability with an engine. A moment when laughter and arrogance would try to strip away his dignity in front of watching eyes. Because sometimes life doesn't ask for permission before turning ordinary days into battles, and his quiet skill was about to be dragged into the center of one. The day started like any other, but it didn't stay that way. He was wiping his hands on a worn rag when the sound of polished heels clicked across the floor. She arrived with a small entourage, her presence sharp, her confidence cutting through the room like glass. A powerful executive dressed in perfection, stepping into a space that smelled of sweat and hard work. Her eyes landed on him, but not with respect, only with a smirk. To her, this wasn't a garage filled with talent. It was a stage for humiliation. She looked at the grease on his apron, the dirt on his hands, and saw not mastery but weakness. And in front of the others, well-dressed men in tailored suits who chuckled behind folded arms, she turned his craft into a joke. With a mocking tone, she issued a cruel challenge. Fix the engine in front of her, and she'd reward him with something absurd, her hand in marriage. It wasn't an offer. It was a performance, a bet designed to entertain the crowd, to shrink him in their eyes, to remind him of his place. Laughter echoed across the walls, bouncing like cruel reminders of every time he had been underestimated. Every time skin color became a barrier instead of a detail, the humiliation burned. Yet he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward. The engine, massive and complex, sat like a test of his very existence. He bent over, tightened his grip on the wrench, and began. Each move was precise, deliberate, fueled not just by knowledge but by defiance. Still, the weight of judgment was heavy. Every whisper behind him carried doubt. Every chuckle fueled the memory of being told he wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. And yet he kept going. Sweat trickled down his brow, his heartbeat pounding louder than the hum of tools. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The engine resisted, bolts stiff, wires tangled, as if it too reflected the fight he had always faced. Layers of obstacles, each harder than the last. She laughed louder, tossing glances at the men around her, enjoying his struggle. To them it was entertainment. To him it was survival. And then came the silence. The crowd leaned in. His hands moved faster, steadier, driven by a fire no mockery could extinguish. The final twist, the last adjustment, every motion carried the weight of history, of pride, of the generations before him who had been forced to prove their worth 10 times over. The air thickened as the engine groaned, teetering between failure and triumph. A single spark could mean victory. A single stall could mean disgrace. Would the machine roar to life, silencing the laughter once and for all, or would this cruel stage become the moment they finally broke him? The garage held its breath as his wrench made the final turn. For a second, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, mockery hanging in the air like a noose waiting to tighten. Then, with a sudden roar, the engine sprang to life. It wasn't just running. It was flawless, smooth, powerful, undeniable. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by stunned silence. But victory didn't bring him relief. Instead, it exposed something darker. The executive's smirk vanished, her face twisting into disbelief. She couldn't accept it. A man she mocked, a black mechanic she had tried to belittle, had just proven her wrong in front of everyone. And instead of acknowledging his triumph, she turned to scorn. She sneered, calling it luck, dismissing his skill as nothing more than chance. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some refusing to meet his eyes. They had watched him succeed, but still, they hesitated to honor him. The humiliation didn't disappear with the engine's roar. It deepened because even victory was not enough to break the prejudice surrounding him. His chest pounded. Anger surged, but so did pride. He had done the impossible, yet the world still tried to bury his dignity. And in that moment, he understood. This was never about an engine. It was about centuries of being forced to prove worth, only to have triumph met with silence or denial. The engine roared louder, echoing through the garage like a heartbeat that refused to die. He straightened his back, lifted his head, and met her eyes. She looked shaken, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. The question that hung in the air was no longer whether he could fix the machine. It was whether society would ever fix itself. The engine's steady hum eventually faded, but its message lingered. He had proven himself in front of those who doubted him, yet applause never came. The executive walked away, her pride too fragile to admit the truth, and the crowd followed, silent and uneasy. He stood alone in that garage, not defeated, but not celebrated either. His victory belonged to him alone, and that was enough, because deep down, he knew he had turned humiliation into resilience. For him, that moment was more than fixing a machine. It was a reminder that dignity is not granted by those who mock or doubt. It is claimed by those who refuse to be broken. He carried that day forward, not as a wound, but as a fire that fueled his determination to keep rising, no matter how many times the world tried to hold him down. But his story is not unique. Across cities and towns, countless others face the same silent battles. They prove themselves again and again, only to find that racism has a way of shifting the goalposts, of denying recognition even in triumph. His fight was not just for an engine, it was for respect, for equality, for the simple right to be seen as fully human. And so the question remains, how many more victories will go unrecognized? How many more voices will be silenced before society finally learns to value every person's worth? This isn't just his story. It's ours to confront. Because racism doesn't disappear in silence, it thrives in it. The choice is simple. Ignore it and let it continue, or speak up and demand change. So I ask you, when the next story like this unfolds, will you look away? Or will you stand?